Welcome to the Jim Beam Masterclass. I am Nana Sechere, and I'm the Portfolio Brand Ambassador for Beam Suntory. At Beam Suntory, we've got a lot of amazing brands. We have great brands in cognac, Scotch whiskey, but today we're going to talk about American whiskey, and specifically bourbon whiskey. So, why are we talking about bourbon? Bourbon's experiencing this pretty big category growth, and it's been happening since 2012. When the craft cocktail revolution happened, you had all those bartenders with curly mustaches and tattoos looking up old historical recipes and bringing it to their bars and putting it in our glasses. And a lot of those recipes back then called for rye. But bourbon, being the national spirit of America, was used and substituted and produced some beautiful stuff. Incredible old fashions, incredible Manhattans. We're gonna talk a little bit about the category as a whole, because at the end of the day, there's no point in talking about Jim Beam if you don't understand what bourbon is. So I'm gonna make sure you understand, because as a North American myself, I wanna make sure you understand our spirit. So without further ado, let me begin. So in the 1700s, you had English, Scottish, Irish, and German settlers arriving to the eastern seaboard of the United States. And when I say eastern seaboard, what I'm talking about is New York State, Connecticut, Maryland, Pennsylvania. Those are the eastern seaboard states, the ones that are closest to Europe. A lot of them left Europe because, as we know, I love Scotland. I love visiting Scotland. I'm sure some of you have been to Ireland, and it's the same thing. And they have great countries now, but at that time period in history, there was a lot going on in terms of persecution, in terms of taxation, and just their way of life being threatened. So what ended up happening is a new tax was introduced, and a lot of people back then who were farming and making whiskey, they ended up deciding that they were gonna head down to the United States, the new world, the land of tomorrow, land of opportunity, and start a new life for their families. So when they hopped on those boats, they had their farming knowledge and their pot stills. They weren't really that big though, they were probably a lot bigger. So when they got down to the US, there were all these little settlement towns, right? There were some Native Americans who had been there first, but people had been settling in the US for a few hundred years at that point. And they started to try and find a new way of life and get used to the terrain. They had orchard fields with apples, grapes, things that you could make ciders and beers from. And then they started bringing in rye and planting it along this river called the Monongahela River. And that's where the first American whiskey came to be. It was American rye. People eventually started leaving the eastern seaboard and going up the Ohio River into the center of the land. The center of America, the heartland, Kentucky. Daniel Boone, all the long hunters, they would come back and tell everyone in the eastern seaboard about what they saw out there. And so people slowly started to migrate, especially since a guy named George Washington, who was the first president of the United States, encouraged people to spread out across the land by paying them money to settle in different parts of America and grow corn, and grow tobacco, and grow hemp, because that was fueling the US economy. So here's a funny thing about farmers. They don't like to waste things. And when they started to grow corn in Kentucky, with the hot sun in the summertime and the cold winters, they were able to grow so much corn in the summer that by the time winter came, they couldn't use it all. So they had to figure out what to do with the extra corn. And since these were Scottish and Irish guys, there was one thing they really knew how to do well, and that's make whiskey. So they started experimenting with corn whiskey. There is actual corn whiskey where it's up to 80% corn. But since they had rye grain, and since they're from Scotland and Ireland and were used to making malted barley whiskey, they started saying, well, what would happen if I combine this corn and this malted barley whiskey? I get a little bit of rye grain in there for some nice spice. Let's see what that turns into. And that's how bourbon was created, in a very loose and non-descriptive story. So, end of the day, bourbon started to be known. It was created in the region of Bourbon, Bourbon County, Kentucky. And they started shipping it down the Ohio River to different parts of America, and people started requesting that Bourbon County whiskey. And that's how bourbon became well known. So let's fast forward to the 1800s. You had 2,000 distilleries spring up in Kentucky. But if you fast forward a little further to 1919, something very monumental in the spirits industry and also in American history happened: the Prohibition. When the Christian temperance movement approached the government and pleaded with them to eradicate the sale, consumption, and production of any alcoholic spirit. And when that happened, the government saw clear examples all over the country of why they should let it happen. Alcohol consumption was a little out of control. They stopped the importation. But speakeasy started to pop up, because the funny thing about human beings, sometimes when you tell them not to do something, they're gonna do it. It entices them more. Eventually, the Prohibition ended in 1933. And in Kentucky, there were 4 distilleries that were able to get things up and running in about 120 days. One of them was Jim Beam. Colonel James B. Beam was able to round up all of his friends and family and start building the distillery. They kept the same recipe that they had from 1795, but they developed a brand new yeast strain. And they got their distillery up and running and were able to get back on their feet. So, let's start with what is bourbon. Number 1, there's a wider definition of bourbon that opens things up to every state in America. But if we're talking about Kentucky straight bourbon, which as far as I'm concerned is the real and true bourbon, there's some regulations you gotta follow. So, minimum 51% corn, that is a must. Number 2, it has to be aged for a minimum of 2 years. And number 3, a charred oak vessel that has been newly crafted. So a brand new charred oak vessel. But the most important thing is that it has to be made in the USA. And that came to be in 1964 when the Congress wrote that into law. I could try and create a bourbon here in Dubai, but unfortunately, it won't be classified as a bourbon. It would just taste a lot like it, if I'm actually that good. Bourbon is also distilled twice. First, it's distilled in a big column distillation, nice and tall. And then the second distillation happens in a pot still, which is actually called a thumper or a doubler in the United States. So the first thing that happens when you distill, you take all of your grains. You take the combination that you're going to work with. So you take your corn, and then the other 2 grains that you would use is rye and malted barley. You would grind that down into a powder. You'd add that to hot water, and you would cook it down. So after you start cooking it, sugars come out of that nice mixture. And then you would add yeast, which is a microorganism that feeds on sugar. And when it feeds on sugar, that creates alcohol. So the combination of the ground down wheat, the water, and the yeast produces beer. So yes, whiskey starts its life out as a beer. So when you combine the flour, the water, and the yeast, that actually produces a beer. And it's nice corn-flavored beer that goes into the column still and then into the pot still, which is known as a doubler. Correct. So once it enters the doubler, you've got 2 times of distillation, and then it gets prepared for aging. Okay, so once it goes into the barrel, 6 different things happen. You add all the whiskey into the barrel and it fills. And the whiskey, which is actually white and clear in color at this point, extracts flavor from the charred oak. So it'll extract caramel, it'll extract vanilla. It'll start gaining a bit of color and extra flavors. But the whiskey will also evaporate because the whiskey is 60% water. And the longer it sits in that barrel, the more heat induces evaporation. Once it evaporates, there's a space where the whiskey used to be and oxygen fills. And that oxygen introduces brand new flavors. As it's sitting, it's also getting filtered by the charcoal that's surrounding that wood oak. And once that's being filtered, coloration happens. And after that, you have the full maturation process. You might be asking yourself, how long does it age, and can it be aged to 30 years like you would in Scotland? Well, the thing is about bourbon whiskey, because most of it comes from Kentucky, it's aged for a minimum of 2 years, but most Kentucky distillers, on average, age it for about 7. So as fast as everything ages in the summer, you've got a cold winter where the bourbon barrel contracts all the pores and you don't lose as much. So after 2 years, you'll have your whiskey. But if you age it for 4 years, 6 years, that's when you have the really good stuff. In Scotland, they can do it a little longer because the thing is about Scotland, and I think every Scottish person watching this can fully agree, the weather, it sucks. It's not good weather. But it's perfect for aging whiskey over long periods of time. So if you want to age it for 30 years, send it to Scotland because it's going to be rainy, it's going to be windy, there'll be some heat, but then in that same day, all of a sudden you're going to have torrential downpour. Never judge a bourbon by how long it's aged. The mark of a great bourbon comes down to one thing. If it's good enough to put your name on it, it's good enough for me to drink. The motto at Jim Beam is come as a friend, leave as a family. And family values are extremely important when it comes down to our whiskey. There are 7 generations of master distillers. We are now entering our 8th generation of a master distiller over the course of 225 years. And as I just said, if it's good enough to put your name on it, then it's good enough to drink. And there are now 8 generations of distillers who are proud to put their last name on that bottle. The first master distiller of Jim Beam was a guy named Jacob Beam. But Jacob, when he came down to Kentucky, he moved here from Virginia. And like most of the settlers back then, he was a farmer and a distiller. He distilled his first whiskey, known as Old Jake Beam's Sour Mash, and sold his first barrel in the year 1795. And that's where it puts us at, to this day, at 225 years of Beam distillation. Fantastic, isn't it? Jim Beam has a fantastic range of products. It begins with the Jim Beam White, and this is the signature flavor that you'll find across the portfolio. If you want to know what bourbon tastes like, the recipe is the most quintessential bourbon recipe there is. It's as base as it gets. This tastes like bourbon because it is true bourbon, a 225-year-old recipe. So we have the Jim Beam Black, which we age to taste. You also have the Jim Beam Double Oak, where they will take Jim Beam that has been aged 4 years in a brand new charred oak vessel, and then they'll transport it into another charred oak vessel. So it's aged in 2 different vessels. So it's got a really pungent, powerful bourbon kick, perfect for sipping. So we've got the Red Stag, which is black currant liqueur mixed with the Jim Beam. We've also got Jim Beam Honey, which goes perfectly with ginger ale. And then one of my favorites, the Jim Beam Apple, which if you drink that Jim Beam Apple soda and get a little spritz of lime in there, it's one of the most refreshing drinks you'll ever taste. I promise you this. Promise you. Scout's honor. So those are some of the very best in the Jim Beam line. Now we're gonna make a couple of incredible highballs. So the thing about the highball, it's across the industry, but Jim Beam makes some really refreshing ones. And the thing is about Jim Beam, it's so versatile that you can pretty much use any ingredient that you can think of or find in your grocery store or your ordering sheets if you're at the bar. So we're gonna start with two of my favorite highballs. One of them is the classic Jim Beam and ginger ale, which it's so refreshing. Ginger and bourbon goes extremely well together because in some bourbons, especially if you have a rye bourbon, it's got a little bit of a ginger bite to it as well. So it just complements that really nicely. And then the other one, fruit juice, namely passion fruit. I think passion fruit on anything is delicious. But if you take passion fruit and you combine it with the sweet caramels, vanillas that you find in the bourbon, it is what it is. So, first thing about the highball, rule of thumb. Always make sure you've got a chilled glass. Especially if you're sitting in Kentucky and it's summertime and it's really hot, you want a nice chilled glass with your bourbon and your highball. So make sure that the glass is nice and cold. Very important. The thing is about temperature, it will influence the way that the drink tastes as well, right? So all terrible accents aside, you want to make sure that it's nice and cold because it'll make sure everything just goes down nice and smooth. You want to make sure that any excess water is taken out. All right, try your best not to lose any ice. And then the most important part, it's not a bourbon highball if you don't have bourbon in it. So let's give it a pour. I'm going to do about 45 milliliters of Jim Beam White. I'm going to make sure I pour it over every ice cube because that chills it down even more. So in case you haven't guessed, the name of the game is temperature. Make sure it's nice and cold. And next up, let's get that ginger ale in there. And when you're pouring that ginger ale, try and pour it through the gaps as much as you can, because then you get more bubbles that way. And the thing about highballs, if you have bubbles, then it's even more refreshing. And now we got passion fruit. Nice and healthy. But the sweetness in it isn't overly sweet, it's just a nice tropical accent to the bourbon. All right. With this, you don't have to worry so much about pouring it in the gaps of the ice. Just get it in the glass. And give it a nice little stir, just a slight one. You don't want to over stir it and lose the bubbles if it's a ginger ale or another fizzy drink. You just want to make sure the bourbon and the ice blends in very nicely. Bam. And now, garnish. So you can have fun with your garnish. You don't need to necessarily stick to one, but with the ginger ale, I'm just going to do a nice lime. There we are. Get it right on the side there. Awesome. And with the passion fruit, I'm going to put a nice little orange slice. Similar kind of profiles, but go for it. If you want to do a half wheel, go for it. Sky's the limit. I'm just keeping it basic to show you where the baseline can be. And there we have it. The Jim Beam Highball, two of my favorites. Jim Beam Ginger Ale and Lime, and then Beam Passion. Enjoy. Thanks so much for watching this video today. It's been a real pleasure making the highballs and talking about Jim Beam. So click subscribe if you want to follow more and get some more masterclasses, because we have so much more that we're going to show you guys and do for you guys. But also, please do share, because we will be giving out to a lucky winner a free personalized label of Jim Beam for you to have in your collection. We also have some goodie bags that we're going to be giving you. We've got a certificate so that you can be a certified Jim Beam expert. And you're going to have your name on it. Just submit your email through our Facebook page, which is Beam Suntory DXB. Also on Instagram, which is Beam Suntory DXB. And give me a follow as well, at Nana Coppertone. Find me on Facebook, Instagram. If you have any questions about bourbon, about spirits in general, about what we do here at Beam Suntory, do not hesitate. I'm here for you. Hope you have a great day, night, afternoon, or wherever you are. Salute.